My impression is that the new Screamer is born from a development context that is far more interesting than usual for a racing game. Milestone isn't selling this as a simple nostalgic cash grab, but rather as a complete reimagining of a historic studio IP featuring an anime aesthetic, narrative focus, and combat mechanics embedded into the racing. This in itself gives me the feeling of a project where the team wanted to step out of their comfort zone instead of just repeating a safe formula. What catches my attention most is precisely this desire to use a classic name from 1995, not to copy the past, but to justify a creative pivot. I like this because when a studio revives an old brand just to nod at old fans, the result usually feels hollow. Here, based on what has been shown, Milestone seems more interested in capturing the arcade spirit of Screamer than the exact look of the original. I also find it very revealing that this project comes from a studio that spent years closely associated with bikes, simulation, and licenses, but had already been returning to cars in games like Hot Wheels Unleashed before attempting something more auteur-driven again. To me, this gives Screamer an air of, now we have the technical repertoire to take risks, as if Milestone is finally using all that accumulated baggage to try and create a new identity instead of just polishing old specialties. At the same time, I see a clear risk. The developer is trying to do a lot at once, with a story mode, 5 teams, a dystopian universe, the ecosystem, combat, episodic narrative, online multiplayer, and even split screen. In my view, this kind of ambition is exciting, but it's also the kind of package that can easily lose focus if the creative direction fails to tie all these elements together around the core sensation of driving. Regarding the gameplay itself, I think the use of twin-stick controls is bold, using one analog for steering and the other for drifting, alongside the cycle of sync, entropy, boost, shield, strike, and overdrive. Personally, I like it when an arcade racer tries to create its own control language, but this is the type of decision that can become a stroke of genius or an unnecessary barrier. So success will depend heavily on how Milestone balances depth and immediate readability for those picking up the controller for the first time. Another thing that makes me look at this development with more curiosity than suspicion is the partnership with Polygon Pictures and the team's insistence on selling the game as a race with dramatic weight, not just a parade of stylized cars. I sincerely prefer this to another generic racing game with a pretty interface and nothing to sustain its personality, because at least here, there is a visible attempt to build a world, characters, and a unique atmosphere for Neo Ray and the tournament. The development context of Screamer feels like a studio trying to prove it can still surprise within the genre it knows best. The project gives me more creative gamble than calculated product, and even seeing the danger of over-mixing racing, combat, and narrative, I find it much more interesting to follow a game that tries to be weird, stylish, and ambitious than another technically competent but soulless racer. The story seems much more ambitious than usual for a racing game, and that already makes the project stand out from the crowd. From what Milestone has released, they are treating the narrative as a central part of the experience, featuring an underground tournament run by a mysterious figure in a corrupted city, with various drivers driven by deeply personal reasons. What I liked most about this proposal is that the game doesn't try to sell racing just as adrenaline, but as a conflict between ambition, revenge, love, greed, and human will. To me, this gives the plot a dramatic anime energy that perfectly matches the futuristic aesthetic and the idea that every race is, at its core, an emotional dispute before it is a sporting one. I also think the decision to build the story around interconnected character arcs is a smart move, as it suggests rivalries, alliances, and clashes of interest that can give each race real dramatic weight. When the developer says that each character has their own story and a strong connection to their car, I feel the game wants to turn the vehicles into extensions of each pilot's personality, and that is a touch I really enjoy. At the same time, I have a healthy dose of skepticism because racing games with deep stories sometimes promise more than they deliver and end up trapped in exposition scenes between events. The good news is that in the case of Screamer, the premise of the underground tournament, the mysterious master, and this dystopian world already feels naturally ready to sustain tension, betrayal, and revelations without sounding forced. Another point that leaves me curious is the admitted influence of 80s and 90s anime and manga combined with animated scenes produced by Polygon Pictures. In my view, this could give the story a more exaggerated, melodramatic, and even slightly cheesy style in the best way. The kind of narrative that embraces personality instead of trying to look like serious cinema all the time. I also really like the idea of the ecosystem because it doesn't seem like just a gameplay excuse to put combat into races, but a world-building element that helps explain why these cars can fight and why this tournament feels so brutal. When a racing game manages to link mechanics and lore this way, the story tends to feel less like window dressing and more like an organic part of the universe. From what I've seen so far, Screamer's gameplay delivers exactly what the trailers promise. An arcade racer, heavy on combat, extremely fast, and with a rhythm that seems designed to rattle your nerves rather than imitate a racing simulator. The proposal of being a racing shooter with its own resource system hooked me right from the first race, because everything seems to revolve around a continuous flow of risk and reward, instead of just accelerating in a straight line. What I liked is what they call Echo, this resource that mixes sync for shields and boosts and entropy for destroying opponents. In theory, this forces the player to think strategically, even in a super fast race. It's not just about using everything all the time, it's about balancing defense, speed control, and that specific moment to activate overdrive to turn the tide. This reminds me of intense combat game models, where resource management is as important as the timing of each attack, and it fits perfectly into the Street Fighter with cars vibe. The twin-stick control scheme, with fine drift controlled by the secondary stick, seems well thought out for this type of game. Instead of relying solely on pressing a drift button, the player has to adjust the angle, timing, and positioning relative to the opponent, which brings a bit more depth to the driving feel. This still leaves room for assistance options for those who want more direct fun, but the core of the game implies that if you want to dominate, you'll have to learn to dance with the controller at high speeds. The game modes shown, such as Team Race and Overdrive Challenge, reinforce the impression that the focus is truly on tactical disputes with KOs, not just crossing the finish line for position. Scoring based on destruction and overdrive combos means that even if you're a bit behind, you can still turn the game around with a single well-placed attack, which feeds into that anime studio race vibe where the underdog can flip the script with one move. It's a type of design that, if executed well, creates those "I can't believe I won" moments that stick in a player's memory. What I'm a bit more doubtful about, just from seeing the material released so far, is whether the resource system might become repetitive after a few hours, or if the balance between destroying cars and finishing first will vary enough between characters and modes. There's also a slight fear that with the large number of resources and abilities, the game might be a bit intimidating for someone who just wants to sit down and race fast without worrying about the micromanagement of sync and entropy. Even so, personally speaking, the combination of anime, tactical combat, high tempo, and this resource system sounds like one of the most promising arcade racers to appear in a long time. If the game can maintain the frenzy without falling into repetition and keep the learning curve digestible, Screamer could become that experience you play, come back to play again because the rhythm is addictive, and end up talking about with friends like, "Remember that time I destroyed 3 cars with a single overdrive?" You know that feeling of seeing a trailer and the game winning you over almost instantaneously just through its visual identity? What has been shown of Screamer hits exactly that spot. What the developer revealed isn't just another generic racing game trying to achieve photorealism, but a true love letter to the cyberpunk aesthetic mixed with the chaotic energy of anime. It is very clear that the team's intention was never to compete with traditional simulators, but to create a visual spectacle that grabs your attention in the first few seconds of acceleration. The art direction shines brilliantly when we look at the city of Neo Ray. The setting is practically a character in its own right, dominated by glowing neon signs, dark asphalt tracks reflecting artificial lights, and an urban skyline that looks like it came straight out of a high-budget animation. The contrast between vibrant colors like magentas and electric blues against the grittier backdrop of the metropolis creates an incredibly charming atmosphere. It's the kind of environment that makes you want to slow down just to appreciate the view around the track. One visual detail that even sparked some discussion in the community is the technical choice for modeling. Many expected an anime racer to adopt a full cel-shaded look, but the team chose a different path. We have 3D environments and cars that are very well rendered with modern textures and lighting, contrasting sharply with characters and cutscenes that embrace 2D line art. This mix might look strange on paper, but in motion, it creates a unique identity that helps differentiate the title from others in the genre. The visual effects are a show of their own. Since we are dealing with a game focused on aggression and resource management, every hit and ability use fills the screen with glowing particles. The use of ecosystem abilities generate light trails and explosions that give huge weight to impacts and the sensation of speed. You feel the violence of the collisions, not just through the sound of the engine or the metal, but by the dramatic way the screen reacts to every successful knockout. And even with all this luminous chaos happening, the car design doesn't take a backseat. The vehicles have a very aggressive, angular look, full of personality, fitting perfectly with the premise of drivers fighting for survival. You can notice in the released gameplay that there is a real concern for visual wear and tear during the race, with sparks flying from the chassis when cars squeeze against walls or opponents. It's a very well stylized aggressiveness. The greatest merit of this graphic design, in my view, is managing to keep everything legible even at extremely high speeds. In many arcade combat games, when you fill the screen with explosions and neon, the player easily loses track of where the turn or obstacle is. Here, it seems the lighting was designed intelligently to guide your eye, using track lights and color contrast to highlight the boundaries of the environment and the enemies. This ensures you can plan your next attack without slamming head-on into the first pillar that appears in your path. Graphically, Screamer is shaping up to be one of the most beautiful and stylish racing games in recent times. It swaps the quest for photorealistic textures for art direction with a lot of personality, tailor-made for those who love speed and pop culture. If the final version can maintain the smooth performance and the visual polish we saw in the promotional materials, we are going to have a graphic experience on our hands that is as enjoyable to watch as it is to play. The performance of Screamer, based on what could be felt in the released materials and press previews so far, seems to be exactly what we expect from an arcade racing game in 2026. Visually ambitious, but charging a price from your machine to run smoothly. Since Milestone built a game that isn't just about speeding, but a festival of neon explosions, heavy collisions, and the ecosystem filling the screen with particles, maintaining frame stability is essential. Fortunately for us, or unfortunately for those who haven't upgraded, they seem aware that any frame drop in the middle of combat would ruin the experience. On PC, recent reports show that the game has a beautiful but heavy visual scope. Those who tested early builds mention that at higher resolutions, like ultra-wide, the game runs smoothly on medium settings, but already requires the use of upscaling technologies like DLSS in balanced mode to keep up. There's even information circulating about the game supporting the new DLSS 4 with frame generation, which is almost a confession that running this raw in native 4K and 60 FPS will be a privilege only for those with top-of-the-food chain graphics cards. This doesn't mean the game is poorly optimized, far from it. What's happening is that Milestone chose to embrace the visual spectacle. When you have cars scraping against walls, throwing sparks, activating sync shields, and firing entropy shock waves, the engine has to process a lot of physics and dynamic light in fractions of a second. For a game focused on reflexes, where hitting a wall in overdrive mode can mean instant death, control responsiveness tied to a good frame rate isn't a luxury, it's survival. Looking at current-gen consoles, PS5 and Xbox Series, expectations are much more optimistic in terms of stability. As is standard these days, it's almost certain we will have performance and quality modes. Honestly, for a title like Screamer, I wouldn't even waste time on quality mode if it locks at 30 FPS. This is the kind of game made to be played at 60 FPS or higher. The sensation of extreme speed and twin-stick drifting requires a clear reading of the track that only a high frame rate can deliver without causing eye fatigue. One point that leaves me very reassured is Milestone's track record. They're not newbies when it comes to racing, and they know that launching a game with stutters or sharp drops in the middle of a corner is asking the community to abandon the title in the first week. Even with all the visual load of Neo Ray's cyberpunk anime environment, the demos so far seem very fluid, indicating that the game's foundation is solid, and they're spending this final time before launch just polishing those performance edges. Of course, as I always say, pre-launch builds and edited trailers are one thing, the game running on a server with 8 people unleashing powers at the same time is another. The true trial by fire for Screamer's performance will be in the online mode, in the middle of a team race, when the chaos is at its peak. If the engine can hold a locked 60 FPS while 3 cars explode in front of you, Milestone will have delivered a true technical masterpiece. I think Screamer will be quite demanding on hardware, especially on PC, but not due to developer negligence, but because the level of detail and destruction and lighting justifies that weight. If you are on the latest consoles, you will likely have a delicious and responsive experience. If you're on PC, start getting ready to adjust those DLSS filters. The important thing is to prioritize fluidity, because in this game, losing a frame can mean eating the dust and neon of your opponents. Honestly, looking at everything Milestone has shown and let the press test so far, deciding if it's worth buying Screamer at launch on March 26th isn't a universal yes or no answer. The game has a standard price of $59.99 or regional equivalent for the base version, which is the current full market value, and even offers a deluxe edition for $69.99 that gives you 3 days of early access. For an arcade combat racer, this price means you need to be sure of what you're buying before swiping your card on a pre-order or day one. If you are the type of player who misses the golden age of arcade racing games, the ones where the fun came from chaos, hitting your friends, and mastering aggressive mechanics instead of just taking the perfect turn, Screamer was made exactly for you. The proposal of mixing racing with a fighting system, the so-called echo management for attacks and shields, is a treat for those who enjoy competitive games with a high replay factor. For this crowd, picking it up at launch makes a lot of sense, because the first few weeks are exactly when the multiplayer meta forms and the community is most vibrant. On the other hand, I recommend waiting a bit if you are a strictly single-player focused gamer who gets bored quickly with repetitive racing loops. Milestone promised a cyberpunk anime-inspired story mode with plenty of personality, but we know that in practice, games of this style live and die by their multiplayer. If the main campaign is short or serves only as a glorified tutorial to toss you into online mode, paying full price at launch might leave a bitter taste. In these cases, waiting for the first sale is always the safer choice. Another group I would advise to be cautious are racing game purists or simulator fans. If you like Gran Turismo, Forza Motorsport, or even more realistic rally experiences, Screamer's approach might be frustrating. Here, it's all about twin-stick drifting, neon lights flashing in your face, and the chance of losing the race at the finish line because you took an overdrive attack from the person in last place. It's a game made for those who love pop culture and combat, not for those who want to simulate tire grip on asphalt. Now, talking a bit about the additions, if you do decide to buy at launch, I honestly think the standard version is more than enough. The deluxe focuses on cosmetics and early access, and unless you are desperate to play on March 23rd or really want those iridescent skins, I don't see much need to spend those extra $10. The physical collector's editions, which can cost nearly $200 and include action figures, are cool, but reserved only for those who are already fans of the original 1995 IP, or those with extra cash to decorate their shelves. I think I'll end up buying it. I don't know if it'll be at launch, because the idea of a racing shooter with an anime aesthetic in a cyberpunk city appeals to me immensely. I really want to test the depth of this resource system on the track and see if it truly delivers that fighting game on wheels sensation the trailers are selling. Screamer is a risky bet for the current market, but it's a bet with a lot of identity. If you have friends to play with or are addicted to mastering chaotic mechanics online, day one will be a blast. But if you play more casually just for the story or are on a tight budget this month, there's no harm in waiting a few weeks to see what the community says about the game's longevity before opening your wallet.